Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Andrew Logie. Andrew is an assistant professor of Asian studies at the University of Helsinki, and he is also the author of some fascinating research, not just into the history of Korea, but into the history of the historians of Korea. More specifically, the phenomena of pseudo-history. This is where, for a number of reasons, Korean historians, or people from other fields, have moved into the area and have tried to make the depth, the nature, and the grandiosity of Korean history much larger, much more important, and much more significant than can be found in the real historical record. Of course, there are a number of reasons for this, and a number of ways in which this is done. And while we do speak about this, and this phenomena a lot in this podcast is much more on the substance of the history, what these people get wrong, and in what ways they do it. In this, we step back into a much deeper history of Korea and into small fundamental details that have a much larger import for the overall field. We make parallels to pseudo-history in other countries such as India. We talk about the ethnic Donghae conflation or the Altaic fallacy, the problem of Old Choson as a charter state, the archaeological finds inside Manchuria, and the problems that this has had for delineating that charter territory of Old Choson. And from this geographical content, there's also the question of the Chinese commanderies, just where they were. What rivers were they delineated by? Were they inside modern-day Korea or inside modern-day China? From this, there's also the question of the Samhan polities and how this influences the history of the Three Kingdoms period, or at least the general narrative that tends to be told inside Korea today. And the designs that certain historians or pseudo-historians have had on linking the culture of Korea to the Neolithic archaeological culture of Hongshan. And this, of course, goes back to what they hope to be the origins of Old Choson. And of course, it steps forward into much more modern phenomena and modern developments that have in turn looked back into history, such as the Wangdan Kogi and the hopes to find this lost civilization of Wanguk. Throughout this, there's going to be a number of different ways that these pseudo-historians have tried to build this up. Through astronomy, through geography, through archaeological finds, through physical documentation. And though some of this history may not be commonplace out there in the field, there is one aspect of this that we are going to touch on in some detail that many people have heard of, and that is the legend or the myth of Tangun. This is the divine progenitor of the Korean nation, the first Korean, and the myth that surrounds him. And as I mentioned earlier, the reasons for this pseudo-history are numerous, but it all comes down to a fairly strong idea that is building Korea up into a great nation, but doing so by fudging and distorting Korea's real history. Now, this is quite a long podcast and really rich in detail, and I will admit from the start, despite reading through all of Andrew's research before the podcast, I was still quite out of my depth. I was just struggling to keep up with the details. Of course, I'm going to link Andrew's primary article below, and as always, I encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. But what comes through most strongly, and what hit me most strongly, was just how meticulous certain historians like Andrew are in the field, and the challenges they are facing from pseudo-historians, and a large body of people who want history to serve a purpose, not just to reveal the truth. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating to the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media, and all the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through Korean pseudo-history, this is Andrew Logie. Andrew Logie, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Hi there, Jed. Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking about a fascinating topic about Korean history, one that I've always been deeply interested, just haven't known enough about or enough that I should know about the topic. And you've done a lot of research on that. And I might begin this interview with a quote from yourself, which might open the field up a little bit. And it runs like this. In current-day South Korea, pseudo-history pertaining to early Korea and Northeast Asia has reached epidemic proportions. So from that, what is this research that you've been doing, and what do you mean by pseudo-history and the epidemic of it inside South Korea today?
Yeah. That's a good opening and, of course, very large question. Partly this pertains to the issue of distinguishing or defining what pseudo-history is. But in broadest terms, we're talking about history that is overlaps with notions of popular history writing, such as the books that you find in commercial bookstores and which are most accessible to the layman or general readership. So as in all countries, if you go in a bookstore in South Korea, you find some essentially wacky stuff in the history sections, popular history writing, which of course is trying to draw in readers. So it will have kind of exaggerations, ideas of excitement about the past. But in the case of Korea, and particularly for early Korean history, this popular and turning into pseudo-history very definitely is overwhelmingly dominant in commercial bookstores. So if you're not very discerning, but you're interested in reading about history, as anyone should be, about early history, if you go into the bookstores in South Korea, the chances are you're going to pick up a book which is pseudo-history, and there won't be much competition in the bookstore. There won't be much opportunity to find an alternative. So this kind of pseudo-history, which obviously we'll have to go on to talk about the content of it, has become quite overwhelming and therefore influential on the popular understandings of the past. So the point that it gets beyond kind of into epidemic as an epidemic is that because it's become so influential, it's also influencing political understanding by politicians, who in turn have influence on the funding for research, for scholarly research on history, both domestic and internationally. So therefore, it's become actually damaging because these pseudo-histories, the writers of these books, have gained no small influence over politicians.
So how does this pseudo-history play out? So how is it done on the ground? I know through your research here I have in front of me, you've detailed a number of methods, I suppose, a methodology in which a lot of these people go by to create this pseudo-history. So before we get into the details here, I might get you to just talk us through just what they are doing. You label a number of very interesting things here that people may be aware of, things like cherry-picking evidence, but there's also things like these hidden agendas that are there behind the scenes, especially in this one, and things like disparaging the academia and the academics field itself. So I might get to start and just open up that idea of just what sort of behavior, what sort of methodology are these people doing?
Okay, well, there's kind of two sides to this. There's the content side in what they describe as being early or ancient history. And in this is partly their hidden agenda, in that they will try to challenge more professional historiography, which is more kind of critically cautious in how it describes the past, with what they want to present in place of that, which is, it comes in various iterations, but essentially the most influential form is the idea that there was an ancient empire that covered all of northern East Asia, so including, well, centered on continental Manchuria, of course, inclusive of the Korean Peninsula, but then expanding beyond that, sometimes including Japan, but more importantly, including parts of China. So the hidden agenda is essentially to be able to introduce this grand idea of ancient history. They need to do this, their strategy, they need to kind of take down the standard models that have been developed by professional and critical historians and archaeologists. So they do this partly through what amounts to a conspiracy theory, which occurs in pseudo-history more kind of universally in the West as well, where you accuse the academic establishment of a cover-up. That for some reason, the academic establishment wants to hide the truth of this grand ancient history.
So let's jump into some of the history then, because I think a lot of the other questions that may be a bit broader may actually play out through the discussion of the history itself. You may see the motivations of some of these historians and why they're doing what they're doing. So, and of course, I'm going to apologize at the start of this for a lot of mispronunciations on my behalf. So, but let's start with the ethnic Dongyi conflation, as you call it here, and this is the idea, at least it seems, the idea of the Eastern barbarian, and this broader idea of how you can create, I suppose, a pan Korean ethnicity. I'm not sure, so I might get to open up that myth for us, just what it is and what is this pseudo history behind it, and what mistake are people making.
Sure, this is a key component. And almost one of the defining characteristics of pseudo-history when they make use of this concept of what I term Dongyi conflationism. So this term, Dongyi, it means literally, if you translate it very literally, it's Eastern barbarian. And this was a term that occurs in Chinese history writings right back to literally the earliest texts, almost not quite to oracle bone inscriptions, but to kind of unearthed inscriptions and such, going back to the Shang dynasty. So it's a term used. It's originally by for shorthand we'll call them Chinese, but the people on the central plain of modern China, and they have the notion that's quite well known of China being surrounded by circles of increasing barbarity the further away you go from central civilization. So the Eastern barbarians are the people to the east. What's crucial in this idea of the Dongyi conflationism of barbarians, is that there are two, most broadly, there are two periods of different groups who are referred to as Eastern barbarians. And the change between the two periods is around the expansion of China under the shortly lived Qin dynasty and then the longer Han dynasty. So we talk about the Qin Han expansion period, which is around the first century, early first century BCE. Prior to this period, so if we talk about pre-Qin, there's a notion of pre-Qin Dongyi, the pre-Qin Eastern barbarians. So these were the people viewed as being Eastern barbarians from an earlier period of China when it had not expanded so far. So partly from the Shang, but this is really a view from the Zhou China. And what was east of Zhou was essentially the Shandong Peninsula region, modern Shandong area of China today. And so when they talked about Eastern barbarians, they were talking about people who, if we look on a map today, quite within kind of central China, but on the east into Shandong Peninsula. But then from the Qin and the Han expansions, this is when for the first time these Chinese-speaking peoples expanded militarily into what is current-day northern East China, the Dongbei provinces, traditionally referred to as Manchuria, geographically Manchuria, and into the Korean peninsula itself. And they simply use this term again because it's relative, Eastern barbarian, to describe people they newly encountered through these military expansions. So if you go through Chinese sources and you look at Chinese history, you get essentially two sets of references to so-called Eastern barbarians. You have those of the Shandong region in China, and then you have those pertaining to Manchuria and the Korean peninsula, and even inclusive of Japan slightly. So the conflation occurs from the perspective of Korean historians is if they treat those two peoples as one ethnic group. And then you get an enormous zone that incorporates all of Manchuria, the Korean peninsula, partly Japan, but then also much of eastern China, including the Shandong Peninsula. So you can draw very large zones and you can claim that this is one ethnic group, a Dongi ethnic group. And then the next stage after that is simply to conflate the Dongi with Koreans, or to claim that Koreans are kind of the chief descendants of this slightly broader Dongi ethnic group. The last thing I'd say about that is then this definition of a Dongi zone is used to describe the territory of the ancient empire.
So how does again, I think I'm using your terminology here, the Altaic fallacy fit into this? Is it the same kind of lines that this is that this follows down? So that new term I've just introduced there, what exactly is that referring to? And does it sort of mesh with this in any way?
Yeah, it certainly meshes. So we got two, these are kind of two mechanisms that are used, or two strategies, interpretive strategies. So the one I've just described, this the Dongi conflationism, that actually occurred in pre-20th century historiography as well. So across the medieval period, Koreans themselves self-identified as Dongi, and they also conflated their Dongi identity with accounts of the pre-Qin Dongi of Shandong in China. So that already existed. What I term the Altaic fallacy, this is based on the notion of the Altaic language family, and initially even the Ural Altaic language family. So this was an idea that was introduced, or that was first developed across the 19th century by European linguists with the development of historical linguistics. And in particular, it was worked on by several Finnish scholars. So there's quite a strong Helsinki connection there. But this idea of language groups, which at the time was also paired with, or directly equated to, ethnic identity, this was also introduced to ultimately to Korea in the early 20th century. And so the idea of the Altaic language family, maybe I should just describe it briefly, and then we can see how it potentially, as you say, meshes with the Dongi identity. So sure. The basic Altaic language hypothesis premises the idea that several language groups, which today we regard as being separate groups, were all part of one language family. So these so-called core language groups around the Turkic languages, the Mongolic languages, and the Tungusic languages, Tungus covering principally the Manchuria region and far eastern Russia. So these were the core groups, and these were being investigated. Early on, they were considered to also be related to the what's now referred to as the Uralic languages, which includes most immediately languages such as Finnish and Estonian, and a few more Finnic languages that are found across Russia, and some more slightly obscure languages. So there is a view early on, from about mid-19th century and continuing into early 20th century, that the Uralic languages and the Altaic languages were part of one family. So you had this term, Ural Altaic language group. And because of the position of those languages being spread across Northern Asia and all the way up to Finland, the location for a homeland of these languages of a single proto-language family was placed somewhere in the Altai region of Central Asia, the Altai Mountains. Gradually, or quite soon, they started to realize that the Uralic languages and the Altaic languages were separate groups. So this gets pared down to a notion of just an Altaic language family. At the same time, they started to investigate Japanese language and Korean language, and they saw what seemed to be structural connections between these languages and the core Altaic languages, such as Mongolic and Tungusic. So then they started that Altaic languages would include the Korean and the Japanese languages as well. So if you take this idea of a language family, whether it's the Ural-Altaic, the largest form being the Ural-Altaic language family, or a slightly pared down Altaic language family, but inclusive of Korean and Japanese, and then you equate this with idea of an ethnic identity, so ultimately some kind of Altaic ethnic identity, this becomes an option, an alternative for those who find themselves placed in this Altaic language family. So in the case of Koreans, it can be a way to define themselves against particularly Chinese cultural identity, which had been very strong for elite Korean identity during the pre-20th century era across the Koryo and the Choson dynasty periods. The overlap between the Altaic identity and the Dongi conflationism is that, as we just noted, the Dongi, the Eastern barbarians, includes peoples of Manchuria and Korean. So these are people who, let's say from the late 19th century and early 20th century, were then classified within the Altaic language scheme. But the difference is that the Altaic language scheme expands further across the steppe to include peoples who are not traditionally referred to as Eastern barbarians, such as the Mongols and early Turkic peoples, who, from the perspective of China, they were northern barbarians principally because they were on what's the Mongolian steppe today. So the Altaic language family, or the Altaic language hypothesis, complements the idea of Dongi ethnic identity, and it provides notion of a homeland in the Altai mountain region, and this came into historical interpretations of the Korean people again with the introduction of the Altaic language notion of the Altaic language family, the idea of a distant homeland from which the people originally migrated is also brought into that. So this is how we get the notion of an ancient homeland in Central Asia and a long-range migration across the steppes of Asia into the Korean peninsula.
So from that idea of an ancient homeland, it might be a good way to step into another question, another aspect of Korean history that you find a lot of interest in research in, and you pull apart wonderfully in your own research here. And that is the question of ancient Choson or Old Choson. And you write here that there's a problem how Koreans see it, and they see it as a charter state. And through your writing here, you see that this is problematic because it's not just, as you put here, it's not just a distinguisher between a current or a historical polity, which was the more recent Choson dynasty, and a later period. But you write that it's actually becomes to obfuscate the distinction between what is actually happening at that historical time. So I might get you to take us there for a moment and open up that particular aspect of pseudo-history for us.
Yeah. So this is maybe the most sensitive topic for Korean listeners, is how this state of or polity of Old Choson, how it is understood historically, because without doubt there's a genuine historical aspect that there was a certain polity that went by the name of Choson in early times. But then this has been elaborated upon with both legend and mythology. So untangling the historical polity from the legends and the myth becomes very sensitive. The reason it's sensitive is because this early Choson polity, so we can call it Old Choson, as that's the kind of orthodox name for it, and helps to distinguish from the later medieval Choson dynasty period. So through early 20th century, from pre-20th century historiography, Korean historiography of itself, Old Choson has been designated as the first state in Korean history. And that notion has pertained today. That's why I suggest this term, the charter state, which I have not invented, is being used by other historians in different contexts. But the idea of a charter state is essentially the earliest period of a state that gives the blueprint for the idea of the state continuing, such that even if a dynasty is overthrown, it will be replaced with another dynasty that claims a continuity from the previous dynasty or the previous polity. So you can trace back through dynasties and kingdoms. At some point, you're going to get to the first polity, or the polity that has later been decided retrospectively has been labeled as the first state. And in Korean historiography, this was the state of Old Choson. And this idea has pertained into modern and current day understandings of Korea's past, such that if you go to the National Museum in Korea or any look at any textbook description of Korean history, it will begin with the state of Old Choson. The problem is the idea of this early state of Old Choson, the traditional dates, they are based principally on mythology. So anyone slightly familiar with Korean history and the notion of Old Choson will have been told or will have read that this state was founded in 2333 BCE. And that's the date associated with the Tangun myth, the Hwanung Tangun story which is a foundation myth for Old Choson. But the Hwanung Tangun story wasn't created or didn't emerge until significantly later, only written down in the 13th century CE. So it's essentially a medieval tradition that evolved and no doubt had slightly earlier roots, but doesn't contain or cannot be directly connected with the historical entity of early Choson.
So let's talk about Tangun then, as you brought it in there, because this is an aspect of Korean history that many people, even if they're slightly unfamiliar with deep Korean history, they've heard of this creation myth. And of course, there's the North Koreans are just as keen on it as the South Koreans are. But of course, as you mentioned there, it doesn't seem to have the deep history that people mention about it. So I might get you to start. Just tell us exactly what the myth is. And as you mentioned there, it emerges very, very late, and yet it catches on. So I might get you to just tell us what the myth is very briefly. You don't have to go through too much storytelling there. But also just how it emerges. It seems to emerge through, I'm not sure if I'm correct here, through Buddhist writings.
So a bit of both. But so what the myth is, let's see if I can do the rendition of the story. So it has three major characters involved. It starts with sky god Hwanun, and then he has a son who is called Hwanung, and Hwanung wants to go down to the world to rule the people and help make their lives better and introduce ideas of early civilization. So Hwanung descends. And descends, I'm not going to get all the exact details in, but descends to a mountain. The story unfolds. In one version, he then pairs or couples with a woman who was formerly a bear, but underwent a certain rite of passage to transform from being a bear to a woman. And she, the bear woman, Unya, consequently gives birth to the demigod Tangun, and then Tangun establishes the state of Choson. So that's pretty much the simple version of the story. This version is found in the Sambuk Yusa, and this is the Buddhist connection you just mentioned then. So Sambuk Yusa, a very famous text of Korean history, and it was compiled by the Buddhist master Ilyong or is regarded to have been completed around 1280, give or take a couple of years. But pretty much at the same time, there's another rendition of the Tangun story written down, a version of the same Tangun story from a non-Buddhistic source, which is it's actually a long poem form, the Chewan Ungi, and that's dated to about 1287. It's largely a similar version of the story, although it cuts down on the story about the bear, which also involves the tiger as well, but the bear is the central character in that. So there's a very slightly more rationalized version of the story, and that it takes out the bear element. But the very fact that there's two versions of this story, largely at the same time, so in the 1280s, implies that it was already a story that had been partially established. Most people, they only talk about the Samguk Yusa version of the story, and therefore they attribute it to Ilion himself. So you'll often get people saying, or particularly this is, say, critics of the story who would say that it's an invented story. They will even lazily suggest that it was Ilion who invented this story, as if just he was writing pure fiction. But clearly there was some kind of tradition with this story, and even subcomponents of the story were already circulating at that time. But this date of the 1280s is when we have the earliest written accounts of the story. And it's significant that prior to that time, although we have some earlier texts, such as most obviously the Samguk Sagi, which is the earliest Korean history, the compilation or completion date being 1145, essentially makes no mention of the Tangun story, which implies that even if the Tangun story was circulating in some form, it didn't have any high level of prestige until quite suddenly across the 13th century. It must have been picked up, such that by the 1280s, it is being used as a foundation story of Old Choson. And just to add the context of the 1280s, is with Korea under or coming under Mongolian rule with the Mongolian invasion. So it's often interpreted that the reason that this is not a creation myth, but this foundation story of Old Choson, the reason that it was kind of put together and promoted at that stage was because the Koryo dynasty found itself under kind of emergency situation being invaded by the Mongols, which caused them to think about their own identity and to develop strategies to strengthen ethnic and what might be understood as early national identity for Koreans.
That's a fascinating look at that history. A lot of people know it. And of course, I'm going to link below the podcast, of course, a lot of the work here so people can go and read that story in more detail, the actual story itself. But it's wonderful how you pull it apart there and seem to separate the different components of it. But one of the interesting things that you seem to be mentioning there is some of the battles that seem to be happening over history, especially around this issue. You talk about the negationist school and the internal fights that different sides of researchers seem to be having about this type of history. So I might get you to touch on just a few things that you came to there, because you seem to have passed down the middle of these two schools, the one side accepting the deepest possible history of the Tangun myth, and the other side tearing it down and negating it, as you said, and simply saying it was a creation. And yet through your research here, you of course give credence to some of that negation, some of the first ideas of where it was found, but you also say, as I think you touched on a little bit there, that throughout that research you gained an idea that it must have had a deeper history there. So I might get you to just touch on that place that you seem to find yourself between those two communities there, or at least when it comes to Tangun.
Yeah. So the pseudo-historians, current day pseudo-historians, and they have their own kind of 20th century history, of developing their ideas. So they certainly have the idea that they take the Tangun myth as being historical. They rationalize it. Maybe we'll go into that in a moment. But they take it as Tangun representing some kind of civilizational event at the very least. And therefore, they take the date of 2333 BCE. They also round it up to 3000 BCE. And they take that as their starting point. For them, that's almost the most secure period of their history. And they have further projections even deeper into time. So those are the true believers of Tangun. On an official level, because the Tangun story has been important for national identity and the notion of Old Choson being the first state in Korean history, the date is often kept as 2333 BCE date, or pushed up to something happening around the third millennium BCE. Sometimes they will drop. So in more, this is kind of current day historiography, official level historiography. They will talk about Old Choson and they will use these foundation dates, but then they might dodge the question of the mythology itself, or they'll use a very standard rationalization where they say it's based on a story of early tribes with their various totems, totemic worshipping tribes. So that's all on the side of the believers. As I mentioned, the other side is those who simply deny the Tangun myth as mythology, which certainly it is mythology. So in that sense, it's not going to be true. But they also see it as being a very late invention, only of the 13th century, which is, as just mentioned, they'll simply accredit it even to Ilion, the compiler of the Samguk Yusa, and say he invented it. Or if they're aware that there's the alternative variant from Jerangungi, they'll say that it was invented very recently during that time. I don't have a definite view on how early the Tangun story evolved. I would guess that this is almost something of an open speculation, but that it was earlier, that it could be pushed back to some kind of traditions that emerged in the early medieval period, probably associated with the north of the peninsula and the Pyongyang region. So possibly a tradition that evolved from even the Goguryeo period of the Three Kingdoms. But that aspect of it remains hazy.
So let's step into another aspect from that to, I suppose, in the same period, and another aspect of pseudo-history, and that it was with Old Choson, of course. Now, one of the other challenges of Old Choson, you're trying to pseudo-historians trying to build up this empire and this grand history. One of the challenges, of course, is the historical boundaries of that particular area. And you put in your research here some wonderful stuff about how they're trying to reach into Manchuria, at least in part, and connect things. I mean, going as far as Inner Mongolia at times to try and just, so a lot of what we touched on earlier, but trying to really drag out the deep boundaries of what Old Choson was. So take us there for a moment and open up that particular part of pseudo-history for us.
Yeah. To answer this question and maybe build on the previous question as well, I think we need to dip slightly into the 20th century development of what now we must term as pseudo-history. So this goes back to some names who are quite well known and have probably been dealt with in some of your other podcasts as well, or have probably come up. So against the context of the colonization of Korea, the annexation of Korea by Japan in 1910, so this is when we talk about early 20th century, you have key figures who led the kind of cultural revitalization movement and developed cultural nationalism as at least as a defensive strategy, but really as a way to to defend Korean identity in the 20th century. So these ideas of early aggrandized Korea, so this ancient empire, these were evolved at that time. The key names, among several others, are the writers, the historian Shin Che-ho and Trenam Son. Shin Che-ho is most responsible for developing the territorial idea, and essentially he wrote a very inspiring and evocative history in which he described Tangun Choson, so the early Choson, as having what he describes it as an empire, and describes it as having this continental territory centered on Manchuria. Trenam Son, meanwhile, did a lot of work on the Tangun myth, on the Huanan Tangun story, and analyzed it according to what at the time were quite acceptable practices of folkloristic analysis. And this involves some of the rationalizing interpretations of the Tangun story. So these elements come together at this time. So with Shin Che-ho, many people have written on this topic, on how Shin Che-ho described early Korea as a Manchurian empire. And Shin Che-ho was quite reasonably trained, or very well trained, as a classical scholar, and he knew the histories, the Chinese histories very well, at least in content. He didn't analyze them as critically as they would be today. So he's able to use a lot of selective evidence from the geography sections of these history books to try to piece together something that seems like a empire.
And in doing that, through your research here, he seems to, at least some of this modern attempt to build this, I suppose, this lost empire up of the mind, seems to have come from some astrological affirmations as well, some claims that I'm not really, it seems to along the way they prove certain astrological signs and they built up the idea as an astrological phenomenon. So I might get you to touch on that. I'm not doing it justice there with my question, but it seems as though that new almost religiosity of looking into this particular period seems to have had some astrological prominence with it.
Yes, although this usage of astronomy to prove some of the locations and the extent of the territory, this has been a more modern, a more recent innovation on the models of pseudo-history. So you have work by really beginning with Shin Che-ho and several others who worked essentially from the traditional sources, meaning pre-20th century written histories, the orthodox histories of China, and then the Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa. They also introduced the idea of the historical linguistics, which was then a modern idea, so the Ural-Altaic language hypothesis, which Shin Che-ho certainly references. And then you have such as Trenam Son introducing folkloristic interpretations. So that's all pre-war, and that's created the basic model of early ancient empire. But then this is still being worked on in more recent decades. And in the example of using astronomy to try to prove this empire, you get similar examples, this kind of more common to universal pseudo-history. And if we think about examples of popular history writing on ancient Egypt and stuff, where they'll have these ideas that the pyramids of Egypt were mapping the stars, etc. So interpretations based on astronomy really can be seen in a slightly more recent context and common strategy of pseudo-history. With the issue of astronomy, this is often traced to, we will have to term them pseudo-scientists in this case, but trained as an astronomer by the name of Pak Chang-bom. Actually, this is one also kind of diagnostic of the practice of pseudo-history, is that you have scholars or scientists coming from other disciplines who then will claim to apply their discipline to support, to provide evidence for schemes of ancient history. And so that's quite common to have astronomers claiming to be able to prove the ancient past through astronomy. And the strategy they can adopt in the case of the Korean pseudo-history is to claim to run programs that can verify the dating of astronomical events that have been recorded in early histories. Of course, astronomical events, most obviously things like eclipses, but even certain constellations being visible at certain times. These were recorded in pre-20th century histories, including Samguk Sagi, because they were important at the time. They were interpreted as omens and such. But in theory, you can prove the dating of sources if you have an early annal that dates a certain solar eclipse occurring. Now with modern astronomy programs, you can actually check these dates and if they match up, and also from what geographical location you might need to have been in for these events to be visible. So Pak Chan-bon, who's partly the source of these claimed affirmations for Korean pseudo-history, he did this for two texts, one being the Samguk Sagi, so the earliest Korean history of 1145, and the other being the Hwandang Kogi, which itself is an apocryphal text that was forged or authored during the 1970s, but which is claimed to be a very ancient history, an ancient text that contains information not only of Old Choson, but of still earlier periods. So in both cases, he claimed to be able to verify astronomical events which were recorded in those texts. But he went further by claiming that some of these events, they wouldn't have been visible if you were on the Korean peninsula, but conveniently they would be visible if you were somewhere in the Chinese mainland, which he then takes as evidence that these observations found in early Korean histories were taken from ancient Korean territory, which was on the Chinese mainland. So in this way, he falsifies, or he claims to provide evidence not only to verify the dating of the texts, but then also to claim to support the claims of immense territory.
So let's get into that question of the size of the territory and the Chinese question you mentioned there, in how far Choson pushed into China itself. And you do a fascinating job throughout this research here of tearing this apart piece by piece. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to it here at all. But you talk about the geography of ancient Choson and the Chinese commanderies. And you talk about the archaeology and the efforts that have gone through to these things. And you list a number of ways in which pseudo-historians have tried to justify just how far Choson reaches into China, or at least Old Choson used to reach into China. And then you begin to tear them all down. And the first one is what you call problem number one, the Pei River. And that is the idea that this river used to have marked the boundary between what was Han China and Old Choson. So why is that river important here? And what is the pseudo-history that surrounds it?
So there's big debates, and this is an area where pseudo-historians can appear to thrive, actually, is in disputing and debating over historical geography, because this is an area for which there's textual information, but it's conveniently ambiguous at the same time. So you can argue over locations, and through arguing over locations, you can essentially argue over the size of territory, especially when you're discussing rivers which have been recorded as representing borders. So the Pei River is one that comes up in the descriptions of the end of Old Choson, the historical end, which is in 108 BCE, and just the years before that, building up to the final Han essentially conquest, invasion and conquest of Old Choson. And in the descriptions of this invasion and conquest of Old Choson, it's established that a river by the name of Pear represented the border, from the Korean perspective, the western border of Old Choson, so the border ultimately between Han China and Old Choson. So the dispute becomes which river was the Pear River. And essentially, there's no definite answer, which gives some freedom in claiming any river that suits can be the Pear River. And of course, there's multiple rivers extending from the Korean Peninsula, from the western side of the Korean Peninsula, all the way around the Bay of the Bohai Bay. There's several rivers, and so to varying degrees, people insist one of these must be the Pear River, and therefore represent the border, the western border of Old Choson. So critical historians believe it to be one of the rivers in northern Korean Peninsula. Actually, the river that has been suggested most often is the lesser-known Chongchongan River, which is kind of midway between the Yalu River, which is the modern Sino-North Korean border, and the Taedong River that goes through Pyongyang. This is premised on the idea that the capital of Old Choson was at the location of modern Pyongyang. So the border had to be somewhere to the north of that. And for various reasons, the Chongchong River has been suggested. If not, the Yalu River is sometimes also suggested, which would match the modern Sino-Korean border. But pseudo-historians, they don't like this idea, because if the river was the Chongchong River, or even the Yalu, it implies that the territory of Old Choson by the end, or the penultimate period of Old Choson, was limited to the Korean Peninsula and limited just to the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. Whereas their idea is that Choson had to have been a large empire. So they rather argue for other rivers, including the Liao River, the Dahaling River. These are going into western Liaoning province and then even into eastern Hebei. And at the most extreme, the Luan River, which is in, if I hope my geography is correct, modern geography is correct, is in eastern Hebei. So by arguing that, they can say that even after Old Choson had shrunk a bit towards its in its penultimate period, it still had a significant continental territory. And what's key here is that they want to argue that the invasions and the conquest of around 108 BCE by the Han China, that it actually failed and that it never reached the Korean Peninsula itself. There's varying degrees of interpretation, simply to say that it failed, or that it crossed the Pear River, but this Pear River was rather the Luan River, so well within modern China, and it didn't go much further than that. And this ties into the next stage of the history. So after Old Choson was overthrown by Han China, they established a series of military commanderies to rule their new territory. And Han China had many commanderies in kind of all directions, but in the context of Korean history, these are referred to as the Han commanderies. Historically and archaeologically, we know that the main Han commandery that survived following the conquest and several reorganizations, the Lelang commandery, it was based at Pyongyang, modern day North Korean Pyongyang, which also provides the evidence for the likelihood that the capital of Old Choson had been at Pyongyang. Hence, the main commandery was put in its place. But the pseudo-historians want to deny the historicity of the Han commanderies, particularly this Luolan commandery, which was the longest lived of the commanderies. And so they rather want to argue that it was never on the Korean peninsula, but that it was therefore perhaps if this invasion had been at all successful, it had only gone across the Luan River, and therefore the location of these Chinese Han commanderies was inside of within modern China in eastern Hebei region or western Liaoning province of modern China. The question is why are they so concerned about the location of these commanderies and the meaning of these commanderies? And this goes into going again to the early 20th century colonial period under the Japanese. And the Japanese famously initiated the archaeological examinations across Korea, but they were specifically looking, among other things, for the Luolan commandery, evidence of the commandery rule of Pyongyang and the northern peninsula. And the essentially kind of true interpretation of this is that it suited the Japanese to be able to prove, this is the Japanese in the 20th century, to be able to prove that Korea and Korean history began under a phase of colonial domination of Han commandery rule in the north. And then they also have another idea about that there was this ancient Japanese control of the southern peninsula. So there was the focus of the Japanese archaeology was to find evidence of the Luolan commandery in the north, and then ideally also evidence of Japanese control of the south of the peninsula. The excavations and investigation of the Pyongyang region did produce evidence of the Luolan commandery. In the case of the south, they failed to find evidence of the Japanese rule that they were seeking there. So the Luolan commandery is, both aspects remain sensitive to national sensitivities, but then also to the pseudo-historians. But the Pyongyang, the archaeology of Luolan commandery at Pyongyang is a real issue for pseudo-historians.
So that is a great view on just how politicized some of this can be and some of the challenges in locating areas and how I suppose the motivation for some of these things. So let's push on to something else here, which runs through your research, which is quite fascinating, and that is the idea of the Samhan polities. And you write here that they are described as occupying a third of the Korean peninsula. And yet, I'll get you to take us there to that historical period here. But pseudo-historians don't particularly like this identification, because if these are true and if this is a correct dating, that it seems to negate the possibility that the three kingdoms and the three kingdoms at that time have an existence deeper into history, so beyond, further deeper than the 3rd century. So what are the Samhan polities and how do they affect our historical understanding of the Three Kingdoms period?
This is another key topic that pertain to general inquiry of early Korea, even critical inquiry of early Korea, but then which is also becomes an issue for the pseudo-historians, and they have alternative explanations. So the Samhan polities, the earliest sources that describe the Samhan polities, Chinese sources, the Sanguozhe, essentially, which was compiled in the 3rd century CE. And they are clearly described as occupying the southern, as I say, essentially the southern half, maybe southern 2/3 of the Korean peninsula. And they were what was south of Old Choson. The issue becomes with conflicting descriptions of the early date for the Three Kingdoms, as recorded in Korean tradition in the Samguk Sagi, And particularly, although we say the three kingdoms, in this case, because we're talking about the southern half of the Korean peninsula, it's so the three kingdoms being Goguryeo, Shilla, and Baekje. Goguryeo being in the north. Here we're interested in Shilla and Baekje. And then there's also the fourth entity of the three kingdoms being the Kaya polities, which was sandwiched in between Shilla and Baekje. So these are, but if we talk about the three kingdoms entities, Shilla, Baekje, and then we'll add Kaya, they're located or they evolve in the same territorial region that the Sampan are described as occupying. And there's perhaps no coincidence that you've got three, as the Sampan translates as the three Han, and Han is being taken as some term for early polity here. So we've got three territorial entities, albeit probably very loosely organized. But the fact that we've got three of them, so we've got the Sampan, and then later we get the emergence of the three southern three kingdoms entities of Shilla, Kaya, and Baekje, implies there was likely some continuity between them in terms of territory. So the Samhan themselves, they're described in the Sangorja from 3rd century CE. This is a Chinese source, and it was based on reasonably direct. There was a military campaign, Chinese military campaign, into at least across the north of the Korean peninsula, when they would have received information on the Samhan. Most of the information that's then written on the Samhan, or like the accounts of the Samhan from the Sangorja onwards, is the same information being repeated because it's clearly from this one source. So that essentially confirms that the Samhan were in historical existence in the 3rd century CE. However, when we get to the Samguk Sagi, the earliest surviving Korean history, which is the history of the three kingdoms, the name Samguk Sagi being history of the three kingdoms, and this referring to Goguryeo, Shilla, and Baekje, it provides much earlier foundation dates of these three kingdoms, which all go back to the 1st century BCE. In the case of Goguryeo, the northern kingdom, there's some evidence that it did something existed by the name of Goguryeo from potentially from the 1st century BCE. So that's less problematic. But the southern three kingdoms, and particularly Shilla and Baekje, they're given in Samguk Sagi, they're given foundation dates of the 1st century BCE, which come replete with legendary and mythological foundation stories. But this conflicts with the evidence from the Chinese sources, which doesn't mention the southern three kingdoms periods until later, not until around late 3rd century CE and onwards. And before that, it rather talks about the Samhan. So because these earlier Chinese sources are more contemporary to events, they're more reliable in telling us which entities actually existed at the time. The Samguk Sagi, which compiled again, it completed in 1145, rather for the descriptions of the early three kingdoms, what it is providing is the orthodox tradition as understood in medieval Korea. And these three kingdoms, once they did emerge, they each continued for several centuries. And of course, most people know the general narrative of the three kingdoms, ultimately with Shilla coming out as the victor in the 7th century. So they had time over the centuries that Shilla and Baekje and Goguryeo existed. They developed their foundation stories and they pushed back the foundation dates of their state. It's no coincidence that in the Samguk Sagi, Schiller is given the earliest foundation date of the three kingdoms, even though historically it's the latest that is mentioned in Chinese sources, implying that it was the last of the three kingdoms to fully emerge, to fully consolidate itself into a kingdom-like polity. Schiller was the victor of the three kingdoms, and it got to write history. So therefore, it's made sure that it had the earliest foundation date in the tradition, which found its way into the Samguk Sagi.
Ah, that is an interesting thought, that one there. So on that same idea of drawing the histories as deep as possible, to give a much deeper heritage here. Before we before we begin to round this off with some questions about the field again and some of the motivations here, one of the other things here that comes through your research is this question of Koreans dating their Old Choson all the way back to certain Neolithic architecture, archaeological discoveries that they find. And this goes back to the Hongshan, or at least the culture of Hongshan. And this is quite a deep history. It goes back to 3000 BCE to 4500 BCE. So why is this happening? Is this just another attempt to build Koreans as, in some ways, the progenitors of all Northeast Asia? And what does that pseudo-history look like? And why does it not hold up? Or why should we look at it perhaps through a different light today?
Yeah. So this topic of the Hongshan. So Hongshan is the name of an archaeological material culture. And it's also a place name from where this archaeological culture was first identified. And the Hongshan culture, it's a Neolithic culture, traditionally, or not traditionally, because it's not a tradition, it's a modern science, dated to roughly 4,500 BCE through to 3,000 BCE. So it's really, it's late Neolithic period. Location of the Hongshan culture, and it has a broad distribution zone, straddles the current day provinces in China of Eastern Mongolia, the Eastern Inner Mongolia and Western Liaoning province. You need to look on a map, but where these provinces border each other. This is the center for the distribution of the Hongshan culture. This where the Darling River comes through, the Darling River. So this region is very convenient to pseudo-historians who would claim the earlier phases of not just Old Choson, but pre-Old Choson to have been centered on the continent in a position where it could expand to become the Empire of Old Choson, both southwards along the kind of eastern China and, of course, into Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. So Hongshan covers several areas of concern to pseudo-historians and even more generally popular historiography, which goes into another kind of side topic, or side but very important topic, of history disputes with China. And these may be quite well known to listeners, the history dispute between China and essentially South Korea over historical jurisdiction of Goguryeo, the northern state of the Three Kingdoms period just mentioned. And Goguryeo has the issue that its territory straddles modern China, its historical territory straddles modern China and North Korea. So when projecting back notions of national boundaries, which is not a very informative practice anyway, it's very easy to dispute over was Goguryeo Chinese or was it Korean? And of course, there's not going to be a sensible answer to that question. So this dispute over Goguryeo heritage emerged around 2004 and really went on for a good decade and still kind of continues today. This is responding to claims made by Chinese historians, which we can't go into too much detail with that, but they are also problematic claims. So it should be emphasized that it's not Koreans alone in this situation and ending up with promoting less critical ideas of the past. They are certainly having to fend off similar exaggerated claims by Chinese scholars. But so this idea of a dispute with China has been very much utilized by pseudo-historians to claim earlier periods of history. And so we've got this idea that early Korea, Old Choson and pre-Old Choson, was empire, and it had this expansive continental territory. Problem for pseudo-historians for a very long time was that there was no material confirmation of this empire. And particularly across the 1960s and 1970s, and then with this forged apocryphal book, the idea of this ancient empire is really exaggerated, and claims are made that it's the source of all Northeast Asian civilization, etc. And they would ideally like some monumentalist remains because they want to be able to compare it to ancient Mesopotamia, the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, or the pyramids of ancient Egypt, etc. Problem is, even for Old Choson, there's no monumental archaeology. So the assertions of pseudo-historians essentially remain intangible, and they can very easily be challenged that they have no archaeological evidence. But the Hongshan material culture that was discovered or the key sites were discovered in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s by Chinese scholars. These represent very, not on the scale of ancient Egypt or anything, but they include some enigmatic ritual sites that potentially could be described as some kind of a temple site. This is a New Heliang site, which is located not so far from the region of Churfang in, again, eastern Inner Mongolia. And this is one of the core sites of the Hongshan culture, albeit of the late phase of the Hongshan culture. And here we have very enigmatic ritual site that turned up remains of a statue that has been termed the goddess statue, and it contains very enigmatic. The key aspect of it is that basically the face, often referred to as like the mask, was discovered. And so, although compared to other ancient civilizations, the remains of the Hongshan remains are relatively modest. They're extremely enigmatic in themselves. Alongside the ritual sites, there's also Hongshan is known for jades, carved jades that were produced in various animal shapes. And these have been variously interpreted as the origins of the Chinese dragon symbol, or alternatively of bears and other animals. So essentially, pseudo-historians have claimed the Hongshan material culture as evidence for their, in fact, pre-Old Choson period of ancient civilization.
So I might get you to as a final question here, there's so much there and so much stuff coming together. But as a couple of final questions, I think we should look on the broader field again, because there's so much detail here and so much pseudo-history going on. And that first question I have in my mind, the idea that this is an epidemic, listening to you now, it feels like an epidemic as well. And from your writings here, you talk about the field and the fights that seem to happen, the idea that the pseudo-historians often come from fields outside of history itself. And for this, they are often rejected or ostracized as outsiders. They then embrace this outsider identity, and then they push forward, and they then take that as a sort of an affirmation that there must be a hidden truth here, that they're onto something. That's why they're being ostracized in this way. And then they, as you touched on the idea of the Japanese there, they begin to label the historians in the field as not so much Japanese stooges, but people still living or still running a certain amount of history that's loyal to the Japanese. So that idea of a deep fight inside the field itself. So how significant is that across historical fields? Or is this something that is just perhaps uniquely virulent inside the Korean pseudo-history and the Korean history departments?
Right. So this issue of the pseudo-historians, their essentially their influence, and why we might describe them as being more problematic than simply some kind of wacky ideas, or even quite kind of inspirational and fun ideas about the ancient past. Is because they've been able to attack the more critical professional historians. And the line, in fact, between pseudo-historians and the professional historians is at times blurred, such that we have even, so we said often pseudo-scientists often come from fields, from outside fields, and then they comment on another field of science in which they are not trained. So you get those examples. But we also have examples of Korean scholars who would be termed pseudo-historians because they're promoting ideas which are essentially pseudo-history, but they're working on at least the fringes of the academic community. This partly shows how influential these ideas have become. So the presence of pseudo-history is a problem on two levels in Korean society today. Particularly, we talk about South Korean society, although some of these issues are certainly present in North Korea as well. On the popular side, it says described earlier on that if you go in the bookstore and you want a book on early Korea, the chances are you're going to end up reading a book which is giving false information about the early past. But then the other side is the influence that they're bringing, the negative influence that they bring to bear on the community of critical professional scholars. Shorthand, I would call them the better scholars, the good scholars. And this should also be emphasized that through focusing on this topic of pseudo-history, it's very easy to give the impression that the quality of Korean scholarship is low on topics of early history and archaeology, which is not at all the case. There's extremely high quality scholarship, which even personally I'm in awe of when I read it, is being produced all the time as well. But it perhaps suffers from the same issue that scholars regularly suffer from, in that the ideas are not being promoted to a wider reading public, and is generally presented as too academically to be able to have much influence. The issue, though, as well, is that because this goes into the topic specifically of Old Choson and Tangun, etc., and now the more recent dispute with China over early history, these can all be presented as being of a kind of national significance, which is why they then negatively influences, for example, funding decisions. When you have government funding available for scholarship, this also brings in the politics surrounding it. And these disputes have flared up every so often from at least the 1980s, where essentially there's had to be some kind of showdown between academic scholars, or the good scholars, and the pseudo-historians. And in these cases, the critical good scholars don't always find themselves being well represented in either public discourse or by even sometimes national institutes, which might provide the venues for these Sometimes it's been open debate. Most recently, it's been inquiry hearings, special committee hearings at the National Assembly, which were held particularly during 2014 and into 2015. And that recent period, represents one of the climaxes of the pseudo-historians, causing immense damage to critical professional historiography. It's occurred based on accusations made by pseudo-historians. Two large projects were attacked and ultimately had their South Korean government funding terminated based on the accusations of pseudo-historians. One of these was domestic and one was international. The domestic one was a digital historical atlas project, which was an enormous project worked on by South Korean scholars to create a historical atlas on a digital platform. And this is something that an equivalent hasn't been produced since, I think, in the 1980s, the Chinese historical atlas, which is still much used because there's been no alternative. So this was an important project in itself. And it was taken down. This goes even beyond the question of pseudo-history. It was taken down it was attacked on the accusation that it failed to represent a Dokdo Island, which I'm sure all listeners will know about issues surrounding Dokdo. The other historical aspect on which it was attacked was for its representation of the Han commanderies, again, the Lelang commanderies. And this has been one of the accusations that has also been used against the international project. The international project was the early career project that was based at Harvard University, but funded through the South Korean government. This early career project, anyone working on study in Korea who has access to university libraries will probably have come across the books that were published by the early career project. And you can also buy them commercially as well. And these books they still exist, are extremely useful to international scholars because they essentially, the greater number of chapters in these books are translations of papers by South Korean scholars themselves. So this was a way to introduce South Korean scholarship, generally the good critical scholarship, to international readership. Because among the topics of early history include the Han commanderies, the Samhan, and such, these have all been treated from a critical perspective. So the pseudo-historians who disagree with these representations attacked the early career project by accusing it of promoting what they term as the colonial view of history, which is, just as you said, claiming that it's a continuation of Japanese colonial era historiography. As a result, both the Digital Atlas Project and the Early Career Project have both had to close down because their funding was terminated.
So as a final question on this, and it runs just from what you're saying there, so it's just a slight continuation there. There's a scene inside South Korea today around pseudo-history that it seems to have a really fundamental national purpose in some ways, as in is important for what the nation wants to be. And you write about this, how it's important for things as abstract as they should be to history as the prospects of reunification, for example. And at the end of one of your articles, you have two quotes from the two previous leaders. So first, Park Geun-hye in 2013 on Liberation Day address. And she says, according to late Koryo scholar Yi Am, the nation is like the body to humans, history is like the soul. And then Moon Jae-in, when he travels to Pyongyang in 2018, says, we have lived together for 5,000 years and have lived divided for 70. And you write through this that this is a phenomena inside South Korea. And of course, you touched on it a lot there, that it's not just that this certain history has value, or they prefer it, or it is a much nicer way to look at themselves. A lot of people inside South Korea and South Korean government are viewing history, it seems, as something that has a purpose, as in it must serve a national purpose, and it is a sort of competition with what has happened in the past. So I might get you to touch on that idea of history being motivated by politics inside South Korea.
Yeah, well, there's the two ends of examples of this issue of Korean history or any national history needing to have a national purpose. This, again, was largely born in response to the Japanese annexation of the Korean Peninsula. And it was these names such as Shin Chae-ho who came out fighting he literally later attempted to fight. But in terms of writing history, that this history, Koreans needed a grand history to regain their spirit, so they could survive as a people and withstand and overcome the circumstance of colonization. And then most recently, it's been the example of the historiography dispute with China over Goguryeo, which is then expanded again. So from early 20th century to 21st century, across this century, there's been these two key examples of using history to fight for national identity. In the case of the colonial period, this was certainly understandable and genuine. The situation with the historiography dispute today is perhaps slightly less, or it's somewhat exaggerated by South Korean, again, not the critical historians so much, but the broader public discourse, which is informed by the pseudo-historians, who would say that China's claims are ultimately leading up to China laying claim and with ultimately some plan to invade the Korean Peninsula, which seems unlikely to happen. The other role of history is kind of a national project. Obviously, this is under the circumstances of division that the peninsula has with the two states. We have at once the two states of North and South Korea. They're competing against each other, and they're competing in terms of claiming legitimacy as the most authentic Korean state. And so there's some kind of competition there to assert the stronger national history between them and to have the strongest interest in early history. And at the same time, there's the opposite side of it, of wanting to hold the peninsula together, and a strong motivation. And we see this in the example of Moon Jae-in when he went to Pyongyang. Not surprisingly, and again, quite understandably, he tried to emphasize the idea of a single nation, a single ethnic nation, which is obviously towards the aspirations of at least reconciliation and ultimately unification with North Korea. It's very easy from that position to be open to the greater exaggerations of the pseudo-historians, who are also working from the same notion of a single ethnic nation again, but with more exaggerated projections into the ancient past. Those two examples that you mentioned there, so we have Park Geun-hye quoting from the Hwandang Koki, and then Moon Jae-in repeating a more common trope of the Korean people having a 5,000-year history. These represent kind of different levels, and both in the context that they occurred, they're reasonably innocuous. They're not directly promoting pseudo-history. In the case of Park Geun-hye, she didn't state that the source was Hwandang Koki. She merely quoted this line, which happens to be from Hwandang Koki. Perhaps there's a question if she even knew that, but somewhere in her government, her speechwriter perhaps was aware of this and so inserted the line. In the case of Park Geun-hye, this is against the context of other areas of pseudo-history. This came up in one of your recent podcasts when you were discussing with Professor Vladimir Tikhonov about the new right, revisionism, which was also very much underway, and in many ways the bigger topic under Park Geun-hye. And this was a revisionist movement, and still is quite active, to revise modern interpretations of modern history to be more positive about the periods of authoritarian rule, including that of Park Geun-hye's father, Park Chung-hee, of course, so the developmentalist decades of the 1960s and the 1970s. And under Park Geun-hye, there was the project to create this single government authored textbook, which would therefore contain a single view of history. Much of the focus was about modern history, but certainly in creating such a textbook, such modern nationalist historians are happily open to ideas of an exaggerated ancient past as well. So this often gets, they're not uncomplimentary, these two views. In the case of Moon Jae-in, the idea of the 5,000-year history, again, it goes to the, and this is a common trope that you hear and read about in Korean history, that Korea has 5,000 years history. So it's entirely unsurprising that Moon Jae-in would state this. But the idea of 5,000 years history, if you count that 5,000 years, that brings us to 3,000 BCE. And this is the generous rounding up of the traditional foundation date of Old Choson, the 233 BCE. And it's ultimately derived from the Tangun Old Choson foundation story, which is itself mythology.
Well, Andrew Logie, I have to thank you for the fascinating history lesson. I based most of my research for these questions on only 2 articles of Andrew's. I'm going to link them below, and I still can't overstate or I can't understate just how little content of it I actually managed to get to. They're the kind of articles that are just dense with material. So I'm going to link them below, and I cannot encourage listeners enough to go and read them for themselves, as well as links to Andrew's other works. So please go and read as much as you can. It is fascinating history, and I promise you a lot more than what we managed to get to today. So on that, Andrew Logie, thanks for coming on the Korean Out podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to try to introduce some of these topics and discussions.